Greetings, Chaos Spawn, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Sometimes it feels a little bit like we live in hell. So let's talk about some demons. Chaos demons have been around in 40k since nearly the very beginning, gaining their recognisable form in 1988's Slaves to Darkness, and even before that the 1987 original rulebook did give us rules for warp entities that one could say are fairly demon-esque, even if they're not full capital D demons. They've also been a notable faction since they're one of the things that tie the Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000 worlds together, mostly just on a thematic level, but sometimes on a more concrete canonical level that one could argue makes both settings less interesting and only really makes sense if you squint. We're those ones. We're the ones that argue that.
But regardless of how you feel about that stuff, Chaos Demons have been around in 40k for almost the whole time. However, despite having demonic army lists show up here and there, it took quite a while before they were given an actual codex of their own. In fact, it took until 2008, 21 years into the game, for it to finally happen. And so, during the 4th edition of 40k, the first codex, Chaos Demons, was ejected into real space. This book was written by Alessio Cavatore and Gav Thorpe, with cover art by Adrian Smith. In some ways it feels less like just another codex, and more like a spiritual successor to the old realm of Chaos books. Not just because it's full of demons, a part of Chaos armies that had been somewhat sidelined for years, or the heavy use of John Blanche and Ian Miller's very recognisable and stylised art, but because it was released alongside a Demons of Chaos army book for Warhammer Fantasy, giving the faction rules for both games along with new miniatures at the same time. But is the 40k one interesting to take a look at in 2025 and beyond? Well, let's answer that in the form of a 20-minute YouTube video. Oh wow, that is actually remarkably close.
First off, for those of you that haven't looked into books from 4th, the codices from this edition can feel like they struggle to have an identity of their own. The earlier ones are formatted like a late-era 3rd edition codex, and the later ones are formatted like a 5th edition book. This one is in the latter category, the last codex of the edition, in fact. So the actual raw army list was plainly listed in the back half of the book, with the fluff and special rules for them in their own segment in the front half. Which, on reflection, was kind of a throwback to the 2nd edition codex format, which also did the everything kinda has two entries at opposite ends of the book thing. Anyway, given the topic today, let's be a little chaotic ourselves and take a look at the colour section first. Just don't tell your mother we let you. And this might be the least 40k colour section in a 40k codex we've ever looked at. Apart from a couple of Demon Prince minis that are very Space Marine coded, and the odd bit of terrain, everything here could be from Warhammer Fantasy if the bases were square. Even the soul grinders that feel very 40k since, well, it's half a defiler, would eventually make the jump to the fantasy side of things after this book, so that's no help. This is obviously just a byproduct of the fact that the demon line has always been shared between both settings, but it's interesting how you could swap out some pages in here from some of the pages from the Warhammer Fantasy Demons of Chaos book released at the same time, and we probably wouldn't have noticed. Hell, they don't even give them any 40k minis to fight against until the very last moment.
Anyway, the Demon minis at the time, many of which were new releases to coincide with the dual Demon book release, were still mostly metal. So while there's some kits in here that are still around today, there's also a lot of older kits that are long gone. Also, we appreciate the inclusion of John Blanche's cheese pizza themed bloodletters. And speaking of bloodletters, we're just going to slowly zoom in on the rear shot of this one for no reason. No reason whatsoever. But it does give us an excuse to mention this book had a lot of little close-ups like that. Granted, some of them are only like 15% bigger and only show it from a mildly different angle, but it's the thought that counts. Finally, for the colour section, we do want to highlight something from the very start of it. This example 2000 point army, which we find notable because it gives you a complete breakdown of its points and war gear, which is always nice to see since figuring this kind of thing out for a new player can be daunting. And the examples of such things are often for smaller starter forces. Now, let's take a look at the lore. As ever when covering something from this era, we'll not be going over everything because once you get to this era of book, there is just too much. There's like 20 pages of fluff before you even hit the unit descriptions, which is another 27 pages that's also mostly fluff. So we're going broad strokes here.
It started by going over the warp, the realm of unusual energies doing unusual things that coalesce emotions into unusual gods that are also kind of the realm itself. It's very unusual. Individual demons are granted life via a small portion of a god's power, but, unlike the gods themselves, are not so tied to the warp and can visit real space to cause mischief. If killed, they will usually simply return to the warp and be unable to manifest a physical body again for an amount of time that is possibly 1,000 years and a day, but really is sort of up in the air since time doesn't really exist in the warp the same way it does outside of it. The gods and their demon servants vie for power amongst themselves, but every 1,000 years or so will agree on a common purpose, such as knocking that emperor chap down a peg or two, but they'll get right back to their internal bickering right after. It's all part of the great game. We were also given rundowns of each Chaos God and their realm within the warp. Khorne, the Blood God, presides over a land of splintered bone, volcanoes and war. Sitting upon a brass throne, he wields a great sword known by many names. Woebringer, Warmaker, Bloodfeeder, the end of all things. Alright, make your mind up. Lord of War, more like Lord of Indecision. The palace of the youngest god, Slaanesh, the Lord of Pleasure, is made of concentric rings, each tempting would-be attackers into an ironic demise based around a different vice. The third ring is the sex one. The cock ring, if you will. It's right next to the ring of gluttony. You can't miss it. The Maze of Tzeentch, the god of change and sorcery, is a large, ever-shifting labyrinth made of crystal. This is just a Crystal Maze reference, isn't it? God damn it. Finally, the Garden of Nurgle is a land of decay and pestilence, much like Hina. From his home, the affable Nurgle concocts new and interesting diseases to dispense upon the universe.
Now obviously, the demons don't stay in the warp and there's a lot about how they're able to appear in real space, but all you really need to know is that it's a bad time when they do. In part because the act of fighting them creates more fear and hatred, and these are creatures born of emotion. There's even a demon world mentioned where there's rivers made of Eldar children's tears. Again, it's a bad time. There's more specifics about what can happen to a world enveloped by a warp rift and twisted by demonic powers, with the tale of the doomed planet Torius. Its populace was subjected to a truly hellish fate, but the main thing we want to highlight is the term pseudo-spud. Don't know why, but the concept of a potato-like thing being called that in a grimdark setting and putting it in a section describing an entire planet being subjected to a fate worse than death is just a little funny to us. We don't feel good about it. Pseudo-spud. Oh, and the planet was eventually virus-bombed by Inquisitor Thrax, who was presumably the same Thrax from the 1988 book Slaves to Darkness, who was also apparently confirmed to be the same Thrax who shows up in Space Marine 1. You know, I'm going to say it, for a minor character, Jerome really gets around.
Gameplay-wise, the big things you needed to know about a 4th edition demon army was that everything was fearless and everything had Eternal Warrior. So you couldn't insta-kill them by just shooting them with something twice their toughness, which, when combined with the fact that demon armor saves were always invulnerable saves, means that even the weaker demons could be pretty hardy. They also deployed differently. The powers of Chaos are not one for lining up neatly on a big grassy field. They are not battle droids fighting Gungans. They tear their way out of the Immaterium and into your back garden. Oh no, a horrible demon. So the whole army would start in reserve, and at the beginning of the player's turn, they'd split the army into 2 groups, selecting one to make the initial demonic assault, and rolling a d6. On a 3 to 6, the ruinous powers agreed with your choice, and you could deep strike that group in on turn 1. On a 1 to 2, the whims of chaos force you to use the other group instead, with the remaining half of the army joining from reserve later, also deep striking. These are 4th edition Deep Strike rules as well, remember, so it was wholly possible to have a unit scatter off the table and be destroyed during deployment. The war gear was also a little different in that they didn't have war gear, they instead had Daemonic Gifts, which was admittedly exactly the same as war gear, it was just called something different. The army list itself continues the theme of unusualness, in that it was mostly HQ choices and named characters. Literally, there are 32 units in the list and 17 of them are HQ choices or named characters. That's just over half. We'll go over the named characters separately, out of simplicity, but the basic HQ choices were the 4 Greater Daemons, the Keeper of Secrets, the Great Unclean One, the Bloodthirster, and the Lord of Change, as well as different heralds for the 4 gods. The Greater Daemons used up a single HQ slot as normal, but you could take 2 heralds per slot, so if you really wanted, you could have 4 of them in an army.
And to continue the pattern of one thing per god, elites were fiends, flamers, blood crushers, and beasts. Troops got to mix it up ever so slightly, with Nurgle getting both plague bearers and Nurglings. This was along with bloodletters, demonettes, and pink horrors, the latter of which couldn't do their splitting into blue horrors upon death thing in this book, sadly. The extra Nurgle troops choice was balanced out, since they didn't have any representation in the fast attack choices, those being Fleshhounds, Seekers, and Screamers, along with Furies, who are both the only non-heavy support unit not to be tied to a particular god, and the proud winners of the Demon we'd somehow never really acknowledged were a thing before prize. You know, like, oh, that's what those miniatures were. Huh. Finally, we wrap up with heavy support, which contained the love child of a Greater Demon and a Defiler, the Soul Grinder, which also happened to be the only vehicle in the entire army. Bit vommy, bit phlegmy, unpleasant. Although, strength 10 tongue. It was alongside the most HQ choice of heavy support choices, the Demon Prince. I suppose having a heavy support choice that's an HQ choice from another army is a very 4th edition Chaos Demons move. Also, since the Demon Prince could be aligned with any one of the 4 Chaos powers, and thus have demonic gifts specific to each, there were quite a lot of different ways to build one, some fairly beefy. So it wasn't in heavy support entirely because the HQ choices were already rammed. It's there partially because of that, but just not entirely.
And whilst we're talking about Chaos Gifts, there were a lot of them, so let's take a look at a few. Boon of Mutation was something Tzeentchian characters could take and meant they could pick any enemy model, roll to hit, and if it's within 6 inches, the target would need to take a toughness test. If they failed, they turned into a Chaos Spawn, so best make sure you have a few Chaos Spawn minis handy. The Instrument of Chaos was a musical instrument many different units could take. It just aided when melee was a draw, but since the type of instrument wasn't specified, it was also a good excuse to give a Demon Prince a sweet bass guitar, or give a Plague Bearer a ukulele, or, I don't know, give a Demonette a rain stick? We Are Legion, another Tzeentchian upgrade, allowed characters to split their ranged fire between different targets, a thing you couldn't normally do at the time, since all the various tortured souls writhing across the ever-mutating body of the demon with this gift were looking in different directions.
Finally, the Pavan of Slaanesh was a song that counted as a ranged weapon, and, upon hitting an enemy unit, would cause it to dance d6 inches wherever the demon player wanted, within reason. Not only did this mean that this somewhat notorious unofficial article from Dragon magazine could become dangerously close to being canon, but it also affected walkers too. So that meant it was absolutely possible to have dancing dreadnoughts, and now that's just what my brain is filled with. The Eternally Dancing Mask could do this 3 times per shooting phase, so mix her with 3 more Heralds of Slaanesh with this particular gift, and you get yourself a dreadnought hoedown going on. Let's finish off by looking at the named characters. And note how I am saying named characters and not special characters, because that's one of the things that changed as the Codex format was altered over the course of 4th edition. They went from, this is a special character that you can only use one of if you have an army that's at least this big, earlier in 4th, to just, here's a normal unit in the list who you can only have one of, since it's a specific guy. Which is pretty much how named characters have been handled ever since, just a normal part of the army list that anyone could take. Which stands in contrast to 3rd edition where, strictly speaking, you needed to agree with your opponent to actually use them in the game. Don't know how common people actually saying no was, it seemed to vary a lot between gaming groups, but it was the thing they could do. So that meant that some people just never took special characters at all to avoid any possible hassle. Anyway, the named characters in here were split into 3 groups: named Greater Demons, named Heralds, and Miscellaneous.
The named Greater Demons were Kugath, the Plague Father, a great unclean one who was once a Nurgling but grew up big and strong by drinking his diseased Ovaltine, and now hurls astonishingly dangerous Nurglings at his enemies. Fate Weaver, Oracle of Tzeentch, a 2-headed Lord of Change who peered into that which should not be peered into, and so can see the future, but was also driven slightly mad by it. Due to his prescience, any friendly unit within 6 inches of him could re-roll failed saves, but if something did actually hit Fate Weaver, he'd need to pass a leadership test lest he retreat back into the warp in shock, since he didn't see that one coming. And Scarbrand, the Exiled One, a bloodthirster who was goaded by Tzeentch into trying to fight Khorne himself. It did not go well. Now he's so cross that he makes everyone else around him angry enough to re-roll failed close combat hits. Next was the Heralds, those being the Blue Scribes, who may or may not cast all the spells you want. The Skull Taker, who could also be taken in Juggernaut or Chariot flavours, the Mask, who was, as previously mentioned, the Dance Commander, giving out the order for fun, and Epidemius. Like all Plague Bearers, Epidemius was drawn to keeping tally of Nurgle's victims, and he gave buffs to your Nurgle troops depending on how many enemies they'd killed. The miscellaneous named characters were the Changeling, who in this book could only be taken as an upgrade to a Pink Horror Squad, and Karanak, the Hound of Vengeance and very good 3-headed boy, who was a Fleshhounds of Khorne upgrade.
And with that we come to the end of our trip through the last codex released during 4th edition 40k. A couple of months after it came out, the 5th edition of the game would be released. Although, since the 5th edition codices shared the exact same format as this one, Codex Chaos Daemons fit in just fine with the 5th edition ones. Honestly, they look so similar, it's very easy to put them in the wrong place on your shelf. Given its place as the first demon-specific codex, it's an interesting one to look through. Although, from the limited data we have of just asking people on social media, it didn't seem to leave a huge impact on people who played at the time, despite being apparently quite a powerful book. It's up to you whether you consider that to be better or worse than the infamy that's often attached to its companion fantasy book. Plus, this book did suffer from the fact that the army was really designed with the idea that you'd be mixing demons from different gods together. So, if you wanted to, for example, do a thematic pure Demons of Khorne army, it was possible, but you'd have very limited options. But to be perfectly honest, that's just kind of a Chaos Demon issue in general, regardless of the book you're looking at.
Still, Chaos Demons are, as ever, kind of a strange 40k faction. The fact that they are the most straightforward fantasy thing but in the far future makes them feel a little disconnected from the other factions, even those factions that are factually just orcs and elves but in space. They're made of magic, ranging in appearance from legally distinct Balrogs to eldritch monstrosities, and their melee and spell-heavy focus only accentuates their fantasy vibe. Just the general tone of this book, all magical realms and poetic imagery made literal, feels slightly alien to the rest of the grim sci-fi setting it's a part of, which is impressive considering that some of the setting is actually aliens. But that's the point, right? The powers of chaos simply are. They're different, unconstrained by whatever setting they're in. Defiantly fantasy themed, no matter how many space laser guns you fire at them.
And that, in our humble opinion, is what makes them so devilishly interesting.
Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please let us know with likes and comments. It's the only way we could ever possibly know, apart from, well, you know, you giving us money to make more of this nonsense over at patreon.com/snipeandwib. You'll also get to see exclusive videos and get your name in the credits. Also thanks to Asa, Geistverse, and Simon, who all sent me stuff from an old issue of White Dwarf I was after, since I ordered it for research on this episode and it appeared to have gotten lost in the post, but actually arrived the day after I wrote the bits that I needed it for. And if you are still here, then I assume that you are one of the people who answered my question about pasta at the end of the last episode. Like half of the comments on that video were about pasta, and you all confused this one guy a whole lot. Good work, everyone. I feel like I should ask you another question now, sort of keep this going. What's your favourite breakfast cereal? I don't know, that feels forced. Answer it if you want. I'm an American Fruit Loops guy myself. The version sold here is awful, as in it's probably not gonna kill me, which the American Fruit Loops definitely would if I ate them as often as I wanted to. So yeah, I guess cereal opinions in the comments.